This event is sponsored by Miro. Miro is the online whiteboard platform where product teams can work together effectively. If you don't know where to start, it's packed with over 50 templates for product teams. Whether you need a Kanban, mind map, retrospective, product roadmap, or user story map, we've got you covered. Try it for free.
Hello everyone, my name is Ritwik Verma and I welcome all of you to this Product School webinar on the topic How Marketplace Products Build Customer Trust. If you have ever used eBay, Airbnb, Uber or Thumbtack, you have used an online marketplace. Online marketplaces have emerged and evolved over the last 20-30 years and have become quite popular these days. In today's session, we will look at the implicit problem that a marketplace faces for customer trust. And we will look at a framework that would help us understand how marketplaces can solve this problem. Before we begin, I wanted to introduce myself. So I started my career with Accenture in IT consulting, specifically in their business intelligence domain. And then I moved to a niche consulting firm focused solely on capital markets called Headstrong, and it was later acquired by Genpact. I transitioned into product management through an MBA, and currently I'm working at eBay as a senior product manager in the customer trust domain. My products include eBay Feedback Score, global seller standards, and payment disputes. Outside work, I enjoy acting in theater and capturing some thoughts in the form of a personal blog on Medium. All right, so let's jump in. Today, we will look at what an online marketplace is and some of the trust challenges that come with a marketplace business model. And then we will deep dive into two types of customer trust problems, intrinsic and extrinsic trust. And in the end, we will conclude with some takeaways. Okay. To understand what an online marketplace is, it's important to understand what an e-commerce company is. All right. So a conventional e-commerce company is essentially any company that allows you to transact on its website or an app. So e-commerce used to be a buzzword in the 90s, but today it's more of a norm than an exception. So any company that allows you to buy its goods or services through a website or an app is an e-commerce company. So consider an example of buying sneakers on Nike.com or booking a hotel room on Hilton.com. All these are examples of e-commerce companies. Note that an e-commerce company owns or produces the goods and services that you need. Now contrast that to a typical e-commerce marketplace. A marketplace does not own or produce the goods and services that you need, but it connects you, the consumers, to providers who could be individuals or businesses that produce or own the goods and services that you are looking for. A matured marketplace typically connects providers with consumers, allows consumers to pay for the services or the product, creates order, but the delivery of the goods and services happen outside the direct influence of the marketplace, mostly offline. So that is in contrast with how e-commerce companies work, right? Now that we have understood the basic difference between a marketplace and a company, let's try to look at an e-commerce transaction lifecycle. And typically, I'd like to use a framework called DOES to understand an e-commerce transaction. DOES stands for Discovery, Order, Experience, Safeguard. Discovery is the phase of understanding what you need to buy. You may start with a very specific item in mind, and you just go to a website, search for that item, land on that item page, and you're ready to buy that item. Or you may need some inspiration. Either way, at the end of the discover phase, you are pretty set on what you need to buy. Then comes the order phase, which is essentially creating an agreement between the consumer and the provider where the provider agrees to fulfill the order or facilitate the goods or services to the consumer, and then the consumer agrees to compensate the provider. The payment could be a part of the order process, or it can come later once the goods are delivered. Then comes the experience phase, which is using the goods or services. So in the case of a sneakers example, on Nike.com, the experience phase would look like shipping the item, tracking the item, getting those sneakers delivered to your address, and then using those. In case of a hotel booking, experience phase would mean booking. After booking the hotel, you checking in, you going to the hotel, checking in, staying there, checking out. That would be the experience phase for that transaction. And the fourth and the final phase is safeguard phase. Safeguard phase is in case something doesn't go wrong, in case something doesn't go right, or something is not as expected, then companies have some policies that safeguard your transaction, that gives buyers the protection of getting their money back. So with the DOES framework, we would look at a typical e-commerce timeline, and we would understand the differences between a marketplace and a company. So if you think about it, across the DOES framework, across the life cycle of the transaction, there are certain differences between an e-commerce company and an online marketplace. An e-commerce company such as Nike may have a limited controlled selection. It may not provide you all the options in the world, but it would have a very focused selection on its website. Whereas on online marketplace, just by the virtue of the fact that anybody can come online and sell anything, there could be immense variety on the marketplace. In fact, that's one of the USPs of marketplaces. A lot of variety, a lot of options. In terms of the order phase, where e-commerce company may have a standardized policy or process to make payments and create orders, online marketplaces may be a bit more flexible based on the provider that you're dealing with and the provider preferences. In experience phase, the e-commerce company would have more control and will be more consistent because they own and produce the services that you need or the goods that you need. Whereas on the online marketplaces, the experience may vary based on which provider you're dealing with. Sometimes the experiences vary based on whether you're dealing with an individual provider or a business provider, right? And similarly, in safeguard phase, since you're dealing directly with the e-commerce company has a direct control over the customer experience and the policies that protect you. Whereas on the marketplace side, it could be a combination of the marketplace policies as well as provider policies. So there's an indirect control of the marketplace. Now, once we have understood the differences between a typical e-commerce company and a marketplace, let's try to look at what are the trust challenges that a marketplace faces. And in order to understand, we'll take a step back and we'll ask the question, what is trust? Where does trust come from? So the first principle of trust is that trust is dependent on certainty. The more certain you are about something, the more trust you will have on that thing, right? So from an e-commerce perspective, trust in e-commerce is nothing but certainty of a successful transaction. Now, when we are thinking of trust across companies or marketplaces, we should ask this question, where is more certainty of a successful transaction? So the question is, which provides more certainty to its buyers, company or marketplace? To understand that, let's again look at company and marketplace comparison through the DOES framework. If you look at the discover phase, an e-commerce company has limited control selection, but an online marketplace has a lot of different variations. However, it totally depends on what kind of item you're looking for. If you are, for example, if you're interested in booking a hotel room, an e-commerce company like Hilton or Marriott would make more sense to you. But if you're looking for a homestay or a different kind of tourist experience, maybe Airbnb is the place for you. So both have their own unique advantages and disadvantages, and the certainty is based on what item you're looking for. So both have quite comparable and on an even ground. In terms of the order phase, although there could be subtle differences and variations across company and marketplace policies on making an order, but if you think about it, the certainty is quite high. If there is one process that the companies would invest the most amount of resources and try to optimize, it's the order process because it directly relates to the revenue. So you can rest assured that if you are willing to buy something, both e-commerce company and marketplace will provide you an option to order that successfully. So again, the consistency and the certainty of order is pretty similar and on an even ground. However, the differences come in the next two phases, experience and safeguard. Because an e-commerce company owns and produces the experience that you're looking for, it is bound to be more consistent. Some of the well-established brands such as Nike or Hilton, they have spent millions in ensuring a consistent process and making sure that the customers have a similar experience across time, across locations. So there is more certainty of a consistent experience, whereas on the marketplace side, the certainty is not as high because the experiences could vary based on who you are dealing with. On the safeguard side, since e-commerce companies have direct control over the experience and the policies that you interact with, the certainty is high as well. And on the online marketplace side, because of the indirect control, the certainty is not as high. So as you can see from the slide, the trust problems arise especially on the experience and safeguard side for a marketplace. And it's purely because they are dealing with providers. They are not producing the services or the goods that you need. And in the rest of the session, we will look at how marketplaces think about solving this problem of taking a bunch of providers, making sure the consumers or the buyers trust the experience and safeguard phase of the transaction, even though they are dealing with different types of providers. Now, in order to understand how marketplaces solve for that, we first have to take a step back and understand, where does trust come from? So if you look at psychological research, it says that when people are trying to make a decision of trusting something, they employ two types of reasoning: deliberative reasoning, which is based on logic, data, metrics, and associative reasoning, which is based on intuition, feelings, experience, and emotions. And if you extrapolate these two types of reasoning to trust in a marketplace, we would get extrinsic trust, which is trust based on visible signals and data that buyers see on a website, and intrinsic trust, which is based on feeling and intuition about a website or the experience that I've had on that website. Now let's try to understand how these two trust systems work when we are trying to book something on a marketplace. Let's look at an Airbnb listing. So I have this listing, I like the location, I like the photographs, and at the end of the discover phase, I'm pretty set that I want to stay here and I want to book this. Now, if I just go ahead and book this based on my requirements and the dates and the price that I'm looking at, without worrying about what specific attributes this listing has or which host has displayed this listing on Airbnb, that shows that I have a lot of intrinsic trust on Airbnb. That is based on my experience with Airbnb, the reputation, or the word of mouth I've heard, or just the look and feel of the website. It's very intuitive. But based on my previous experiences, I understand that listings on Airbnb are not homogeneous or of the same quality. And what looks on the website and the experience that I actually have offline may vary. So I need some more extrinsic signals to understand whether I can book this listing or not. And for that, I need extrinsic trust signals, which is displayed here in the form of cancellation policy. There are ratings and reviews, such as great location given by guests who have stayed here and great check-in experience. I also have a 5-star rating, 4.42 out of 5, which tells me that this listing has a specific rating given by the guests who have stayed here. In order to make a booking and understand whether I would like to stay here or not, both trust signals are important. What I think about Airbnb, what I think about the platform itself, and also what I think about this particular listing. So essentially, these two types of trust are nothing but trust on the providers, which is extrinsic trust, and trust on the marketplace, which is intrinsic trust. And most marketplaces need to solve for both the trust in order to make sure the buyers are satisfied and they have all the information they need before they book on the website. Now, before we go and understand how companies solve for intrinsic trust and extrinsic trust, let's take a look at the trust signals that companies, marketplaces employ to understand and build trust products. The first type of trust signals are objective trust signals. These are based on data, metrics that companies track. Today, we have huge capabilities in terms of data frameworks that companies have. There is a lot of tracking that is enabled by websites and apps, and companies can track a lot of data. So throughout the DOES framework, the life cycle of an e-commerce transaction, companies are tracking a lot of data. For a marketplace, in order to understand the quality of a transaction and the quality of interaction with the provider, those metrics could mean communication or response time during the discover phase when the buyer is trying to understand which listing or item they want to buy. During the order phase, they may measure the acceptance rate of the provider or the cancellation rate. During the experience phase, they may measure what was the delivery time it took, what were the specifics of the delivery process. For example, in an Uber ride, Uber may measure what route was taken by the driver, how much time it took, what was the average speed, and so on. There are multiple things that can be measured. In safeguard phase, companies or marketplaces may measure how many buyer issues were reported and what was the resolution time for those issues by the provider. So as you can see, these are hard data metrics that are used by companies to effectively measure the quality of a transaction. But there is still an important gap. If you think about it, the customer experience outside these experience on the marketplace itself, on the website, it's still a question mark. You can measure all the objective data and metrics in the world, but it will not help you understand how did it make the customer feel. You can estimate it, but you would not understand what was the customer experience quality. In order to, and just take an example of Uber, even if you measure the average speed with which the trip was done, or the route that was taken, or the amount that was charged to the buyer, these are all objective data, but you don't know how the rider felt while they were in the car, how the driver made them feel during the ride. And to fill that gap in terms of signals and understanding of customer experience, most of the marketplaces employ the second type of signal, which are subjective trust signals. Subjective because it's based on users' sentiments, emotions, feelings. And most of the companies, whether you buy something on eBay, you book something on Airbnb, or you take a ride on Uber, ask you for feedback. Right after the transaction is over, they ask you to rate the provider, they ask you to rate their skills across a multitude of factors. And they use those signals in some form. And all these marketplaces are complementing subjective signals, such as feedback and ratings, with objective signals that they can measure during a transaction. Now that we understand these two types of signals, let's go ahead and look at how companies build intrinsic and extrinsic trust. So intrinsic trust, which is trust in the marketplace itself, are built through three methods primarily. The first is intermediation. A marketplace may want to control some aspects of the customer experience. Although the definition of a marketplace is a platform which connects providers and consumers. However, there are multiple steps in which this connection happens. Provider can onboard on the platform, consumers can onboard on the platform, providers may list an item, consumers may browse an item, pay for that item, and then the transaction happens offline. A marketplace may decide to own or influence some of these steps, and that's what intermediation is. A great example of intermediation is fulfillment by Amazon. So on Amazon, even a third-party seller can send their item to Amazon warehouse, and then Amazon fulfills the order for those sellers. So essentially, Amazon is intermediating the shipping process. So if you think about it, once the item is stored in the warehouse and the buyer has bought the item, there is very little difference between how a Nike would fulfill that order, which is through a consistent, standardized process, and how an Amazon order will be fulfilled, again through a consistent, standardized process. So essentially what Amazon is doing with intermediated shipping is it is giving a more e-commerce type experience to its buyers, which brings more trust on the platform itself. The second method through which marketplaces solve for intrinsic trust is manage provider performance. This is extremely crucial because in order to maintain a service quality on the website, marketplaces need to manage provider performance. And through a mix of objective and subjective signals, which we will look at in the next slide, companies such as eBay, Airbnb, and Uber manage their providers' performance. They incentivize the good providers and they penalize the bad ones. And lastly, the third method is protection policy. Protection policy is just to ensure during the safeguard phase, buyers have some protection through which they can trust the marketplace and trust the fact that if something goes wrong, marketplace policies would protect them and help them get their money back. So now let's look at how popular marketplaces such as eBay, Airbnb, and Uber have solved for these. Now, for the intermediation phase, eBay has a program called eBay Authenticate, where it gets some of the high value items authenticated, and that helps buyers trust those listings more than the regular listings. On Airbnb, they have Airbnb verified program, and Uber has vehicle inspection, where a driver can go to an Uber location and get the vehicle inspected. As we discussed, managing provider performance is extremely crucial. eBay has a product called Global Seller Standards, which incidentally I own. What we do in that product is we look at a bunch of objective metrics, and by objective we mean hard, cold data related to selling performance, and then we segment sellers into top rated, above standard, and below standard. Airbnb also has these host levels called superhost, experienced host, and Airbnb, as far as I know, they use a mix of objective and subjective signals. So they look at metrics and data related to hosts, as well as they also take into account subjective feedback from the guests. And similarly, Uber also has Uber Pro program, which segments drivers into diamond, platinum, gold, and blue. And just like Airbnb, Uber also takes into account objective signals as well as subjective signals. And lastly, as you can see, all of these platforms have some kind of protection policy or refund policy that gives buyer the assurance that they are covered in case something goes wrong, right? And if you just zoom out and look at these products and try to understand what these products are doing, these are establishing a basic service level or quality on the marketplace itself. These products are telling the buyers that you can expect a certain basic minimum quality from the marketplace, which should give you the confidence to buy from our website without thinking too much. And that's what intrinsic trust is. trusting the marketplace itself. Now, let's try to look at extrinsic trust, how companies build extrinsic trust. And extrinsic trust, as we have covered earlier, is all about displaying trust signals on the marketplace. And there are two types of such signals: trust signals about the provider and trust signals about the product or service itself. And most of these marketplaces, again, use a mix of objective and subjective signals to show how skilled the provider is and to also show how good the offering is, because a provider can list multiple offerings through multiple uh, stays on Airbnb and through multiple listings on eBay, for example. So let's compare how marketplaces build and solve for extrinsic trust. If you look at eBay and Airbnb, they have details about the provider, feedback score, there is top rated batch on eBay, and then the products that are listed. There's a hotness signal, 46 people viewed this per hour, and there is product ratings, and then there is objective data like guaranteed delivery by a certain date. All these signals are there to tell you that this listing and this provider can be trusted. On Airbnb also, you have details about the providers and ratings that are given by users. But if you look at Uber, it's a very interesting case that Uber does not have any extrinsic signals. When you are trying to book an Uber ride, all you need to do is provide the destination and confirm. And although you can see the number of cars that are around you, you don't have an option to choose which car. First of all, you don't even know which car is what model and what kind of car it is. Although they have some broad segments like UberX and so on. But if within a segment, you don't know whether you are choosing a Honda or a BMW or what kind of driver it is with what rating, right? Which is interesting. There could be a supply and demand at play here, but there is also an important concept which could be at play, and that is Uber is telling its riders that you don't have to choose which driver, which car. You can just trust in the platform, and the intrinsic trust that you place in the platform is based on the minimum service level that we offer to all our riders. And although Uber is collecting feedback on how did the driver do, it is not allowing riders to use that feedback to select which driver they want to ride with. Which brings us to a very important question. Do marketplaces even need extrinsic trust signals? Do marketplaces need to provide signals related to their providers and help buyers choose which providers they want to go with? To understand and answer that question, let's look at two very different marketplaces, Etsy and DoorDash. Etsy is a typical online e-commerce marketplace that is primarily known for unique artistic items sold by sellers who could also be the artists or the manufacturer of those items. DoorDash is typically a food delivery marketplace which connects consumers to dashers who are just folks specializing in last mile delivery. If you take these two sets of providers, the sellers on Etsy and the dashers on DoorDash, you would realize that there is very little specialization on the DoorDash side. It is a homogeneous group of providers, and the attempt to homogenize the provider group is so much that DoorDash even has t-shirts of the same color with the logo, almost like a uniform, that tells the buyers that you don't even need to distinguish these providers. These are basically providing a commoditized service to you. So there is very little need for buyers or people who are ordering food to choose which dasher they are going to get the food delivery from. And that tells you something about extrinsic trust signals. Whereas on the Etsy side, these are sellers who are artists potentially, and the items that they are selling are pretty unique. They don't have a unique universal product code. Um, the items are as unique as it could be, and the items are very closely associated with the sellers themselves. So the ratings or the reviews that you provide on the item are ratings and reviews on the provider themselves. And buyers, prospective buyers especially, need to understand how trustworthy these providers are, because there are heterogeneous group of providers on Etsy, and which differ in the skills that they have and the offerings that they have. And that's what the scale looks like in terms of extrinsic trust signals. On one hand, you have Etsy, where the providers is a heterogeneous group, and on the other hand, there is DoorDash, where it's just a homogeneous, commoditized service providers, which need not be distinguished from each other. So on a scale of Etsy to DoorDash, every marketplace has to decide whether they are going to be more like Etsy when it comes to extrinsic trust signals, or they are going to be more like DoorDash. And that's a question to all marketplaces, and of course that depends on whether you are in X industry or Y, and what kind of providers you're dealing with. But research says that intrinsic trust is more valuable than extrinsic. And given an option, you should be more like DoorDash than Etsy. As per an article on Harvard Business Review, it was found that when making decisions that has high risk, especially on e-commerce websites, buyers rely on intrinsic trust much more than extrinsic trust. And it completely makes sense, because if you trust the website, if you trust the capabilities of the website, it just doesn't matter who you are buying it from. And that's the ideal state to be in. If you're a marketplace, the trust on the marketplace itself should be enough for you to buy from that marketplace. It almost brings you at parity with an e-commerce company like Nike.com, right? So the question is, extrinsic trust signals are important or not? The answer is, it is important, but only if you need to sufficiently distinguish your providers. And the companies need to attempt to reach a stage where intrinsic trust is just enough for the buyers to buy that item. So with that, we will now conclude with some takeaways from the session. The first takeaway is the marketplaces should aim for intrinsic trust over extrinsic trust, especially because the intrinsic trust signals are more effective, and if buyers have enough intrinsic trust on a marketplace, they would just ignore any other signal about the provider, and they will trust the marketplace more. Intrinsic trust can be increased through intermediation, performance management, and buyer protections. Basically, they are ensuring a minimum service level or quality level on the website that buyers can expect and trust. Extrinsic trust is important when providers are specialized, heterogeneous, and buyers have an actual need to distinguish provider A from provider B. All right, with that, we conclude this session. I hope you had a good time learning about trust frameworks across marketplaces, and I encourage you to think about marketplaces that you interact with and see how they build trust frameworks, build trust products, and build your trust on those marketplaces. So with that, I thank you for attending this session and wish you a good day. Thank you.